You're driving along a wooded back road in northern Ohio. The GPS blinks, then goes dark. The trees grow denser, looming over the cracked asphalt like they're trying to hide what's ahead. Then you see it, a faded sign nailed crookedly to a tree. Road closed. Do not enter. But, of course, that only makes you want to go further. Welcome back to Hauntings and Happenings. I'm your host, Casey, and tonight we're headed into the shadows of a town that doesn't officially exist. At least, not the way the stories say. This is Helltown, Ohio, a place wrapped in warning signs and whispered rumors of satanic cults, mutated monsters, and toxic government secrets. But what if I told you that Helltown isn't just a ghost story? What if it's a symbol of environmental dread, of communities torn apart, of what happens when human beings are forced to evacuate and nature is left to rot? What if Helltown is a reflection of us? In this episode, we're peeling back the plywood boards and rusted gates to examine Helltown through the lens of apocalyptic landscapes and the myth of contamination, a psychological and cultural phenomena that has more to do with how we process grief, environmental decay, and existential anxiety than with any one ghost or killer. According to Gregory Betty in his article Helltown, Ohio, the environmental disaster that no one wants to talk about, published on Medium, the rumors of chemicals and cover-ups might not be all fiction. Betty writes the Boston Township was forcibly vacated by the U.S. government in 1974 under the guise of national park preservation. But whispers of toxic spills and government secrets quickly filled the void. And that's the thing about voids. As Betty points out, when there are no official answers, people start inventing their own. We'll explore the eerie physical reality of Helltown, but more importantly, we'll ask why our collective imagination is drawn to contaminated places. Why do we turn abandoned land into horror stories? What does it say about us when we're more afraid of an empty road than we are of systems that emptied it? We'll dig into the legends. We'll sift through the psychological fallout. And we'll meet the monsters, real and imagined, that still haunt this silent town. So buckle up, because we're going deep into the woods, and we may not come out clean. Before it became legend, Helltown was just Boston Township, a sleepy patch of northeastern Ohio nestled in Summit County. Founded in 1806, it was the oldest village in the county, according to Urban Legends of Ohio, Helltown by Mahi Chef, a quiet rural community. Until the 1970s, when everything changed. On December 27, 1974, President Gerald Ford signed legislation that allowed the National Park Service to acquire private land to create the Cuyahoga Valley National Recreation Area, now Cuyahoga Valley National Park. Sounds like a win for conservation, right? But for the residents of Boston Township, it marked the beginning of an erasure. As detailed in the Wikipedia entry on Boston Township, Summit County, Ohio, the government began aggressively buying up homes, sometimes forcing people out under the threat of eminent domain. Whole neighborhoods were cleared out. Houses were boarded up and marked for demolition. Fire departments used some for training burns. Roads were closed, signs went up, and just like that, a town was emptied. It's here in this hollowing out of everyday life that the myth of Helltown was born. Imagine your streets slowly going dark, One neighbor moves, then another. Then the houses are shuttered. Trees creep back over sidewalks. The mail stops coming. Betty captures this perfectly in his article, where he writes it's a ghost town, but not in the romanticized Wild West kind of way. This is a graveyard of the suburban dream. And in the vacuum of silence and decay, rumors took root. Was it really about national parks? Or was there something more sinister, like a chemical spill the government wanted to bury? Were those boarded up homes just acquired? Or were they quarantined? As the Ghost in the Machine article Haunted Road Trip Helltown, Ohio notes, the abruptness and secrecy surrounding the evacuations only fueled the speculation. The article describes Helltown as, quote, a perfect storm of urban decay, restricted access, and institutional silence. Ingredients for myth-making if there ever were any. Soon, strange stories began to spread. Of a church with inverted crosses, a haunted school bus frozen in time, and woods haunted not just by ghosts, but by something far more twisted. Stories we'll return to later in this episode. Because while the history of Boston townships was erased from maps, it was recarved in whispered tales. The name Helltown stuck, because the reality was already uncomfortable. The government took a town and left behind an eerie shell. But if you added a cult or a mutant deer or a haunted bus, that was easier to believe than the cold mechanics of bureaucracy and land seizure. It gave the town a story. And as we'll see, stories like this don't die. They metastasize. Abandonment is unsettling, but contamination, that's terrifying. Because abandonment means something left, contamination means something infected. The story of Helltown didn't just evolve into ghost stories. It mutated into something more primal, something apocalyptic. In his article, Betty recounts the theories that emerged after the government cleared out Boston Township. Among them, a chemical spill, allegedly covered up by officials, that rendered the area unsafe for habitation. Stories of mutated animals, disoriented people, and underground quarantines started to surface. And those stories struck a nerve, because beneath them lies a deep psychological fear. The fear of invisible threats. As Betty puts it, when there are no official answers, people start inventing their own. But these aren't just stories. They're manifestations of something called the toxic sublime. In her article, Toxic Sublime, Imaging Contaminated Landscapes, scholar Jennifer Peoples described the toxic sublime as the strange emotional experience of encountering places that are both awe-inspiring and horrifying due to environmental damage. They look quiet, but feel wrong. Beautiful, but dangerous. Peoples writes that these landscapes evoke a paradoxical combination of attraction and repulsion, a psychological push and pull between aesthetic wonder and existential fear. Helltown, with its boarded-up windows, cracked roads, and keep-out signs, embodies the toxic sublime. It's a space where the visual cues of normalcy are interrupted. No, corrupted. And that rupture forces the mind to fill in the blanks with horror. And that horror isn't just rooted in the physical. It's emotional. According to Paolo Cinconi and colleagues in their 2023 article, Eco-Emotions and Psychoterratic Syndromes Reshaping Mental Health Assessment Under Climate Change, the psychological toll of ecological devastation is increasingly recognized as a form of trauma. Cianconi defines psychoterratic syndromes as mental health conditions triggered by the severing of ties between people and their environment. This includes eco-anxiety, climate grief, and a particularly haunting term, solastalgia, the distress caused by watching your home change and decay before your very eyes. Imagine that. Trauma not from war, not from crime, but from watching the land around you fall apart. It makes sense then that Helltown's myths are so grotesque, that they fixate on mutation, corruption, and death. The land itself becomes a symbol of loss, and our minds filled that loss with monsters. But what if the monsters were already there? Not in the woods, not in the church, but in the fear that we're the ones who poisoned it all. Helltown's legends, chemical spills, satanic rituals, genetic mutations aren't random. They reflect what Cianconi calls eco-fear, the rational terror that something irreversible has been done to the earth, and now we have to live with the consequences. And sometimes, it's easier to believe in a curse than a cover-up. Because if Helltown is haunted, maybe it's haunted by what we've done, and by the silence that followed. We don't like blanks. The human brain is wired for meaning. When something strange happens, especially something unjust or unexplained, we try to understand it. And if the truth isn't available, we make one up. That's what happened in Helltown. In the wake of Boston Township's evacuation, as homes were boarded up and neighborhoods erased, the people who remained, or who came looking for answers, began to craft their own explanations. And those explanations turned into legends. In her article, Haunted Road Trip, Helltown, Ohio, author Lucia Peters identifies Helltown as a perfect breeding ground for folklore. She notes that the town's eerily empty roads, restricted access, and silence from authorities created what she calls a vacuum that begged to be filled. And fill it we did. We told stories about mutated deer with glowing eyes that roamed the woods, the result of a chemical spill no one would admit to. We imagined a haunted school bus, its windows forever fogged by the breath of murdered children. We whispered about a satanic church where inverted crosses supposedly marked the windows and rituals took place under the cover of trees. None of these legends existed before 1974, but they took hold like weeds in an untended yard. According to the article, The Ghosts of Ohio, Lore and Legends in Boston Mills, these stories were not carried by newspapers or formal histories. They were passed mouth to mouth, folk transmissions growing in scope with every retelling. And there's a reason why so many of them involve invisible threats. Toxins, cults, rituals in the woods, spirits on the bus. As Betty pointed out, we have an instinctive fear of what we can't see. When confronted with land that is visibly changed, and inexplicably so, people search for a cause big enough to justify the sense of dread they feel. That's why mutation and corruption become the common thread. These weren't just haunted house stories. These were invasion myths. They tapped into fears of environmental poisoning, biological distortion, and moral decay. And they weren't unique. All over the world, we see the same patterns. Places where environmental tragedy, government silence, and community displacement fuse to create something more than ruins. They become legends. In Centralia, Pennsylvania, a fire that started in an underground coal seam in 1962 still burns today. Over time, the fire released toxic gases, caused ground collapses, and rendered the land unlivable. The town was eventually condemned. Homes were bulldozed and residents relocated. But unlike a clean ending, Centralia was left in limbo. Its roads still led somewhere, but to nothing. Plumes of smoke rise from the earth. Heat warps the pavement. And so, in the absence of official clarity, people imagined monsters. Tales of demonic portals, ghost miners, and even ties to Silent Hill, a horror franchise loosely inspired by Centralia, took hold. What began as a real environmental catastrophe became a folk horror landscape where the line between the real and imagined melted away. In Pripyat, Ukraine, the town adjacent to the Chernobyl nuclear power plant, the 1986 explosion released radioactive material across Europe and created the infamous Chernobyl exclusion zone, a 1,000 square mile no man's land still heavily restricted today. The visible decay of the city, the crumbling Ferris wheel, the overgrown schools, has become the backdrop for stories of mutated creatures, ghostly children, and time loops. But more than that, Chernobyl became a symbol of institutional betrayal. How a system designed to protect life could so catastrophically fail to do so. The silence from the Soviet government and the disaster's immediate aftermath only fueled suspicion, fear, and conspiracy. Themes that echo powerfully in Helltown's own legend-making. In Whitnum, Australia, it was the air itself that became deadly. A blue asbestos mine operated there for decades, despite growing concerns over health impacts. Eventually, the government declared it unsafe and erased the town from official maps. Roads were closed, warnings were posted, but for years, no compensation or explanation came. The residents were left to grapple with sickness, loss, and silence. Today, Whitnum stands as a ghost town, not just physically, but symbolically. A testament to what happens when environmental neglect is denied and buried. And in that vacuum, myths began to swirl about lingering contamination, cursed land, and conspiracies to cover it all up. What these sites have in common, and what Helltown shares with them, is a process that cultural theorist Rob Nixon calls a slow violence. In his words, it's violence that is gradual and out of sight, often unrecognized until its effect has settled deep into the land and the psyche. This slow violence breeds something insidious, the sense that something is wrong, but no one will admit to it. That's fertile soil for myth. And as Peters puts it, in Helltown, it's not what you see that frightens you. It's what you suspect lies just beyond the trees. So the myth grows, because silence is unbearable, because mystery demands a monster, and because sometimes it's easier to believe in a killer than a cover-up. Sometimes you don't need ghosts to make a place feel haunted. All it takes is a sign. Road closed. Keep out. No trespassing. If you've ever driven into Boston Township, or what we now call Helltown, you've seen these signs. They're everywhere. blocking side streets, hung crookedly on old trees, spray painted on plywood nailed to what's left of a house. Some official, some not so much. And they're doing more than just warning you away. They're inviting you to wonder, what are they hiding? This is what researchers call the forbidden zone effect, a psychological phenomenon where restrictions themselves create a lure. According to Paolo Cinconi and his co-authors, humans experience what they call a systematic insecurity when familiar landscapes become unstable or inaccessible. We feel disconnected, disoriented, and we fill that disconnection with meaning, even if it's the terrifying kind. The same was true in places like Chernobyl's exclusion zone or the ruins of Wittenum. But Helltown takes it further, because the borders there aren't clearly defined. They bleed across hiking trails, quiet neighborhoods, and old roads. You could be in Helltown without knowing it. Until you hit the next sign. And that ambiguity is powerful. The article If Helltown Exists, Where in Cuyahoga Valley National Park Is It? By IdeaStream Public Media emphasizes that there's no official town called Helltown. Boston Township still exists. People still live near it. But the shifting boundaries between the public and private land, between forest and road, between what's real and what's imagined, make the place feel liminal, like a veil is hanging over it. Liminal spaces are uncomfortable. They're between states, neither occupied nor abandoned, neither past nor present. And they trigger what Freud once called the unheimlich, the uncanny. The familiar made unfamiliar. The homestead turned into something just slightly wrong. The uncanniness is amplified in Helltown's geography. Narrow roads that seem to end abruptly in the woods, resident streets that once held homes now end in gravel and forest, and driveways to nowhere. And of course, there's the End of the World Road, a local legend all on its own. A road that slopes downward so steeply you can't see the bottom from the top. Drivers say it feels like you're driving off the face of the earth. And if that weren't enough, it's surrounded by dense trees and stories of people who never came back up again. Are these just rural back roads and clever names? Or are they symbols of something people felt but couldn't say? As Rob Nixon's theory of slow violence reminds us, when destruction is invisible and unacknowledged, we mark it ourselves. And those do not enter signs may have begun as legal warnings, but over time they became something else. They became ritual markers. They turned the land into a taboo. And taboos in the human psyche don't just create fear. They summon it. So maybe the real terror of Helltown isn't what's behind the signs. It's the fact that someone needed to put them up in the first place. You search Helltown, Ohio on Google, and you get over 1 million results. Pages of urban exploration blogs, YouTube videos with night vision screams, shaky cam footage of teenagers trespassing down gravel paths, claiming to see cults in the woods or eyes in the trees. But the internet didn't create the legend. It just fed it until it mutated. Let's start with the core myths. Those reoccurring, chilling tales that keep resurfacing no matter how many times they're debunked. These stories are more than campfire fodder. They're modern folklore, symbolic, adaptable, and emotionally charged. According to Mahi Shutt's article, the most persistent tales include the following. The first, the Satanic Church, a small white nondescript church in the middle of the forest. The myth? It hides inverted crosses carved into the wood or painted onto the doors. Supposed evidence of satanic worship. Locals claim to have seen hooded figures prowling the area at night, and that the church is always locked, even though no services have been held there for years. The building is real. It's actually the Mother of Sorrows Church, a Catholic chapel built in the 1800s. But once the government took over the area and services ceased, its isolation and eerie stillness gave rise to its new, diabolical reputation. The next is the haunted school bus. An old, rusted bus parked at an angle just off the road, swallowed by brush. The legend says it was full of children on a field trip, or a ski trip, when it broke down near Helltown. A woman flagged it down for help, but it was a trap. Depending on the version, a psychotic killer or a satanic cult member murdered everyone inside. They say if you look in the windows, you'll see shapes in the dark. Or worse, you'll hear the screams of children long dead. In reality, the bus was temporarily used by a local family as shelter during home construction. But facts don't make for good ghost stories. The image of the abandoned bus covered in vines speaks more than any explanation ever could. Then there are the mutants in the woods. Thanks to rumors of a chemical spill or government experiment gone wrong, many believe the surrounding forests are home to mutated animals, deer with human-like faces, dogs with missing skin, figures in the trees with growing yellow eyes. These stories were often tied to the now defunct Krekel Chemical Company or the nearby EPA Superfund sites, despite no public records connecting those to Helltown specifically. But fear doesn't rely on official documentation. It feeds on what might be true. Then lastly, the end of the world road, a narrow road sloping so steeply downward that it seems to disappear into the abyss. At the bottom, locals say is a place where time stops, cars stall, or worse, people vanish. Known in real life as Stanford Road, this stretch winds deep into the forest with a disorienting grade and no outlet. It became known as the Road to Nowhere and later End of the World Road, because in a place already defined by loss, what better metaphor is there? And then came the match to the gasoline. In 2017, the Travel Channel aired a special simply titled Helltown, a 1-hour documentary that presented itself as an uncovering of the town's dark secrets. It featured faked archival footage of a military quarantine, actors playing locals claiming to have witnessed rituals, claims of a satanic superstorm, a fabricated weather phenomenon said to protect the cult, invented military footage of federal agents fighting something in the woods, and a final segment depicting a complete blackout, suggesting that something had broken loose. According to Bethania Palma's Snopes investigation, does Helltown film document weird happenings in abandoned Ohio town? The entire special was a scripted drama filmed on location, but presented with no on-screen disclaimer. It blurred the lines between found footage, mockumentary, and reality TV. And it worked. Search interest in Helltown spiked after the episode aired. YouTube reaction videos flooded the algorithm. Teenagers began making late-night pilgrimage videos. Reddit threads speculated about which footage was really real. The urban legend was no longer localized. It had gone viral. Lucia Peters called this modern folklore, artificially constructed folklore that leverages traditional storytelling forms but uses mass media to launch a myth to scale. In this way, the 2017 Helltown wasn't just a spooky special. It was a catalyst, catapulting decades of whispered stories into the digital bloodstream. Helltown had always been eerie, but now it had production value. As outlined in the article The Little House of Horrors, the internet didn't just spread Helltown's legends. It gamified them. You don't just read about the haunted church. You go and see if it's there. You don't just hear about the school bus. You live stream yourself knocking on the glass. You film it. You post it. You add to it. Helltown became the perfect myth. One with blurry boundaries, official silence, and just enough truth to let imagination finish the job. By now you've heard the stories. You've walked the empty streets, seen the boarded windows, listened to the whispers of cults and ghosts and chemicals and cover-ups. You've seen Helltown as a haunted place. But here's the truth. We need places like Helltown. Not because they're gateways to some underworld, but because they're mirrors into ourselves, our fears, and the trauma we're too afraid to name. In the article by Gianconi and his colleagues, they argue that the climate crisis and environmental decay more broadly creates a profound psychological rupture. People mourn not only for what has been lost, but for what is changing too fast to understand. They call this solastalgia, the grief you feel while still at home, watching the land around you transform into something unrecognizable. And in places like Helltown, that grief doesn't go away. It just transforms into stories, into legends, into warnings. These legends aren't random. They serve a purpose. In a world where we often feel powerless against climate change, industrial destruction, and political secrecy, stories like those in Helltown let us reclaim the narrative. We can't fight a bureaucratic land seizure, but we can warn others about a cursed road. We can't undo a chemical spill, but we can imagine something still out there, still watching. That's why the myths fixate on mutation, on tainted innocence, on banishment. Because deep down, we're not afraid that Helltown is haunted. We're afraid that we did the haunting. We abandoned the land. We poisoned it. We ignored the signs until they were rusted through. And now we look at the ruins and whisper, something evil happened here. But maybe the evil wasn't supernatural at all. Folklorist Linda Degg once wrote that urban legends express the values, fears, and anxiety of those who tell them. In Helltown's case, those values are about loss of control. Those fears are about ecological betrayal. And that anxiety? It's the tension between wanting to forget what happened and needing to remember. Because places like Helltown give us something sacred. A place to put our fear. A stage to play out the end of the world in miniature. A metaphorical fire escape. And like all good folklore, it doesn't end. It just mutates into new shapes, new videos, new warning signs nailed to new trees. So yes, maybe the stories are fake, but the feelings behind them, the unease in your gut as you pass a crumbling fence or an overgrown trail, the pull to look back one last time, that's real. And maybe that's enough. So what is Helltown really? It's not a single story. It's a convergence of broken trust, ecological loss, and the deeply human need to explain the unexplainable. It's what happens when silence echoes too loudly, when roads are closed but questions are left open. We've seen how abandoned landscapes become contaminated not just with toxins, but with meaning. How fences and signs become symbols. How trauma leaves gaps that only myth can fill. Helltown is more than a place on a map. It's an emotional artifact, a haunted house built of fear, loss, and secrecy. And that's why it lingers. Because long after the houses are gone, the stories remain. Because legends thrive where answers don't. And because sometimes what we're really haunted by is the part we played in the story. Thank you for joining us on today's journey into the unknown. If you enjoyed this episode of Hauntings and Happenings, don't forget to subscribe, leave a review, and share it with fellow seekers of the strange. Got a story, theory, or a haunted hotspot you want us to explore? Reach out to us at our email, hauntingsandhappenings@gmail.com, and you might just hear it in a future episode. Remember, the world is full of mysteries waiting to be uncovered, and together, we'll keep searching. Until next time, stay curious, stay cautious, stay spooky, and of course, keep it weird.